I cold LinkedIn messaged Marshall Webb, who was the AFSOC commander at the time, and said, I hear you're interested in autonomy for AFSOC. And he messaged back.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the US Department of Defense each year, but so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley. All right, everyone. Welcome back to Crossing the Valley. I am excited today to be joined by the CEO and founder of Merlin Labs, Matt George. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Noah. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, man, this is going to be a fun conversation, but I'm a big believer in kind of the starting with why. And so I'd love for folks who maybe haven't encountered Merlin before or met you personally at a conference or at a demo or on the battlefield to hear a little bit about how Merlin came to be.
Yeah, totally. I think in general, life's too short to work on boring shit. So we get to go build what the next 100 years of aviation looks like, and do that alongside some pretty awesome customers and pretty awesome partners. Last 100 years of aviation have been built around an airplane plus a human. Next 100 years of aviation are definitively built around autonomy plus an airplane. And our vision and our goal here is to usher in what that next 100 years of aviation looks like. Do that in an incremental way, but also do that in a way that delivers real value both to our civil partners as well as our military partners. And along the way, by doing that, we're making aviation a lot safer. We're making aviation a lot more accessible. And we're also doing things that take humans out of harm's way in some of the most dangerous missions that they can be exposed to. So, I don't know, it's kind of fun. We get to go work on big flying robots all day in a way that, I truly think defines the next 100 years of aviation and delivers some really important short-term benefits to our partners. It doesn't suck.
That's for sure. I mean, we're recording this for about a week or two into the new administration, President Trump's administration. I think there are real questions over whether a manned fighter program is even going to persist under this budget and under this administration. Seems like you guys are kind of right at the crest here.
I think that the Air Force has procured its last aircraft with a flight deck. I think everything moving forward, NGAD, NGAL, which is the next generation sort of C-17 replacement, and NGAS, which is the eventual replacement for the KC-135, the KC-46, and others. No particular insights, but I think that those airplanes will all be procured without a flight deck, sort of on them. So put me in the camp of, hey, look, we're moving forward and we're going to jettison those legacy systems on those airplanes. Happy to talk more about our thoughts around optionally piloted and why that's a dumb idea. But anywho.
I mean, wow. So no, you heard it here first. Matt's proclaiming the end of manned fighter programs. That's our future. I shouldn't say the existing, but future procurement. It's a big deal, or not just fighter, but airplanes or platforms generally. Let me ask you this flip side of that though. Why are we not there yet? What's really hard about autonomy in the skies?
Well, this is just my opinion, right? So I think that everyone thinks that the hard part of sort of autonomy is the really, really high end stuff, like the stuff you see in Top Gun of BFM and swarming and all of that stuff. It's hard. Don't get me wrong, it's hard. But the actual difficult part of transitioning from where we are today to that inevitable autonomous future is the kind of unsexy stuff of reliably flying airplanes and doing so with a fully onboard non-human pilot. And doing the 99% of flying that human pilots do and doing that consistently and safely. And if you tackle that problem, adding on higher level skills like BFM or swarming or particular types of mission execution, those are apps on top of that core infrastructure. But that core infrastructure really hasn't been built yet before at least, what we've been doing here at Merlin.
Yeah, it's one of these things where on one hand, everybody's kind of known that planes, even commercial planes, have had autopilot for, I don't know, 100 years. I mean, it seems like a really long time.
Since the meaningful autopilot since the 50s.
Okay, so about 75 years or so, we've had autopilot on planes. And yet, you think about some of the biggest scandals in aviation, Boeing and the MCAS system and these things that are meant to these software programs that are meant to help humans or reduce reliance on
on humans, and it's still super hard. And I'm just kind of wondering what you see as, we have similar things in maybe in ground autonomy too, self-driving cars. Now finally in 2025, we're seeing they're at sort of at scale inside San Francisco and inside Arizona, but they're not nationwide. It just seems that like autonomy in all domains just takes maybe a little bit longer than we initially expected. I'm curious where you guys are at. Like how Elon's telling us fully self-driving is always, it's like 6 months away. It's like always almost here. Where do you think we are in the development trajectory?
Two major answers to your question. The first is that a lot of the advances that have been happening, outside of, both sort of strict autonomy, so things that have happened in the AI world are really, really, really helping everything along, even if not directly, right? Like it's an important tailwind that is meaningfully speeding up progress across the industry. And then sort of the second part of the question I think is really important, it's really fundamental to our approach, is that when you try to get computer systems to help humans as an adjunctive sort of step towards autonomy, where you have sort of a computer a little bit in the loop and you have a human like kind of in the loop, like that's where you get bad stuff. So our approach at Merlin has been giving the autonomy system full control over the airplane with the human being a supervisor and sort of a backup. So Noah, if we were flying together for the first time, I don't know how good of a pilot you are or you aren't.
Well,
but either way, like my hand would be really, really, really close to the stick of the airplane until like I trusted you. But we're not going to both be fighting for the controls of the airplane, right? Because that's like how everybody gets into trouble. So we have a very similar approach where the Merlin pilot, which is what we call, sort of our core system, is in control of the airplane. Like it is flying the airplane. It's talking to air traffic control. It's making decisions on behalf of the airplane. But you have a human supervisor that is able to go, click off the system and say no and take back over. You eventually start to build more and more and more trust in the system so that the no events become increasingly rare. So we've taken an approach where we are putting our system into airplanes like the KC-135 and the C-130J, where our system can sit alongside a human pilot for hundreds of thousands of hours on normal missions, building that trust and confidence. And then and only then do we think we can transition to like that future state of autonomy really taking full control of an airplane without another human aboard. But the distinction between remotely piloted and assisted, we think that is where all the badness is. And we think that sort of the future is like really on board autonomy, supervised by a human until we gain trust in the system.
Yeah, wow. I mean, so it's kind of flipping on its head. It's not human assisted. It's almost machine assisted. Of like, machine is the driver and the human only intervenes when absolutely necessary. It's a cool reorientation.
Especially for our military customers, it allows the human pilot to go be like a much more thoughtful actor. So instead of a human pilot having to go, in case of one of our AFSOC customers, turn left over a point, they can think a little bit higher level about how to affect a mission and be much more of a mission commander, which especially in sort of the modern sense of warfare is going to be progressively more important.
Yeah, I think the term used to be something like let the machines do what they can do so the humans can do what only they can do. At least that used to be the case. I don't know if AGI is here, but we'll see. But that's another conversation. Matt, before we go any further, I got to ask, like, how did you come into this problem set? Your background's, from the White House to industry, you've started some companies. I know you like working on interesting things, but what in your life led you to founding this one?
Yeah, it's funny. I ask people this like every interview that we do of like, hey, like why airplanes? And like universally it's, hey, I went to like an air show as a kid or I got exposed to airplanes as a kid. And like, yeah, same. So, my last company, we were sort of peripherally involved, but, got to have a pretty front row seat, sort of the second generation of autonomous driving companies. So, the Zookses, sort of the Waymos, the Cruises at that point, right, who were working on those really hard problems in ground autonomy and got a full appreciation for both the promise and also how hard a lot of those problems are, especially in ground-based autonomy. So when I had the opportunity to go start another company, two convictions were true that, hey, autonomy is really hard, but also autonomy is the future of how the moving world is going to work. So where are there opportunities to deploy autonomy in a way that A, you can keep a human in the loop in a way that is economically meaningful, right? Versus going and essentially sort of sending out a human driver, sort of with a safety pilot or sort of a human driver, in an autonomous car where you're not really getting the benefit of that autonomous car until you get the safety driver out. So where could we deploy autonomy in a way that was economically meaningful? And where could we do it in an environment that was like markedly simpler than the streets of San Francisco or the streets of Phoenix? So thus Merlin, deploying autonomy up in the sky. I'm a pilot. I've always loved airplanes, had a good sort of appreciation of how hard the problem would be. But I think we picked the right problem set. We picked the right problem environment. And it's a much simpler environment than driving, but also doing so in a way that is economically meaningful for our customers, that saves them a ton of money while keeping a human aboard the vehicle.
Isn't that funny? It's like, you hear this all the time. It's like, it's much simpler than driving. You're like, that thing is in the air. Like, it doesn't feel simpler than driving because I can drive and my, your 16-year-old younger brother can drive. But
no, you're wrong. Like, there's harder parts that you can't pull over. But it is simpler in the fact that you can deliver really meaningful capability while still keeping a human pilot aboard. You just go from 2 down to 1. It is simpler where you don't have to sort of spend the billions and billions and billions of dollars to get to like a saleable, economically viable product.
Totally. There's another design choice that I wanted to ask you about, which is that you guys are in the defense and the military markets, which are, notoriously simple sales processes. I know as listeners of this show know. And I guess the question is, when you think about commercial versus government and the interplay between the two, where did you start from a customer discovery process and for building your early products? And give us your window into your thoughts behind that.
We started from day one thinking about the military, not as the ultimate customer, but as the first important customer. So we've designed the Merlin Pilot, sort of what we're building, as truly agnostic to what type of airplane it is it's in, whether it's a military airplane or a civilian airplane. But the military is an important early adopter, especially for anything autonomous, sort of up in the sky. So we started out with, sort of these like very basic canard pusher airplanes that, we bought for, a couple $1,000s and put some very basic computers in, literally duct taped like dry ice to the computer because it kept overheating. But we showed that customer we showed that product to some early customers and started to talk about like a portable onboard autonomy solution versus, what they traditionally thought of, which is remotely piloted solutions. And it really, really resonated. And we've been going with the military ever since, with an eye though towards not developing anything that, paints us into any blind corners explicitly for the military, because the FedExes and the UPSs and the DHLs and others of the world are also very interested in autonomy. And we're building for a broad customer base.
It's interesting that, not just that you chose the military, but I guess like why military first, right? When a lot of folks do think that the commercial sales processes are easier or, there are more targets, like you're talking about. It's not one buyer, but it's a smaller number of buyers when you come to the government. The sales cycles are notoriously difficult. I
think a lot of companies have started out in the aviation space or like the aviation technology space, dramatically underestimated the bureaucracy of the civilian regulator. That's not knocking the civilian regulator. It's just like a fact of life. And in order to like have some like product producing revenue with, civilian customers, you have to deal with the civilian regulator. So I think we went into it eyes wide open of saying, where can we build a product that we can get, $1 million of like actual revenue by the end of the sort of the seed stage period. Sort of funny story. I bet Josh Koppelman my right kidney. Josh is like a notorious, famous venture capitalist who founded First Round Capital. And as part of the seed round, I bet him my right kidney, specifically my right kidney, that we bank $1 million of defense revenue before the end of the seed stage. And I no longer owe Josh Koppelman my right kidney. So the military was an important early customer because it allowed us to get that customer validation quickly, which prevents you from building like an exquisite, cool product and actually forces you to build the product that customers want.
And crucially, it kept you well equipped with both functioning kidneys.
Correct. I'm putting some nephrologist out of business somewhere.
Well, I guess the question is, what did Josh owe you? Which body part did you extract?
None. He had all the negotiating leverage.
Oh man, those venture capitalists. Huh? This must have been, couldn't have been 2019 then. That's how you know. All right. So, let's talk then about that early go-to-market process with the government. And you all, I know you've played with cooperative research and development agreements with Kratos. You've played with SBIR. You've played with, ordering vehicles off of that. Talk just about your first touch point and go back to those early days. Matt George shows up in a government facility and says, "Hey, I'm here to automate your pilots." Like, what was that like? And who was the first person that kind of gave you a serious look?
Yeah, I can try to find you a screenshot. I cold LinkedIn messaged Marshall Webb, who was the AFSOC commander at the time, and said, "I hear you're interested in autonomy for AFSOC." And he messaged back and then said for me to connect with him. And I knew nothing at this point, right? That it was totally not a thing, just cold outreach to the 3-star. And the rest really is history. So General Webb connected us to, sort of his team, who was also confused and perplexed about what was going on. General Webb handed us off to General Slife, who took over, after him. And General Slife had a very clear vision, as did General Webb, around, sort of the future of what AFSOC would look like, sort of embracing autonomy. And we transitioned pretty quickly from SBIRs to then an OTA, and that now has turned into a production contract, sort of a 9-figure production contract with tens of millions of dollars spent against it, which is pretty cool. And, working very closely with AFSOC, sort of ever since up into sort of Mike Conley, who's sort of the current commander, and then broadening our aperture, throughout the Air Force based off the success in that first customer, particularly the Air Mobility Command and Air Combat Command. We try to stay away from the lab environment, not because there's anything wrong with that, but we've really focused on doing some simpler but more customer adjacent work directly with the end users.
Amazing. And we're going to dig deeper here because everybody cannot walk away from this podcast and think that if you email the 3-star, you're guaranteed a contract. That is not how it works, right? However,
but it takes that a little bit of that mentality. I think I see, and my God, I've done 99 things wrong and maybe one thing right. That's true story. But I see a lot of founders now, especially in the defense tech space, who spend years, 2 or 3 years, building this really, really, really exquisite product, and then say, all right, well, inevitably the customer will want it, right? And I think if there's any piece of advice for people to take out of this is show your D- work. So Ben Ling, who was at Khosla for a long time and now founded his very successful venture firm called Bling, really, and was a huge sort of mentor to me, especially early days, is show your customer the D- work. And that's what we did. And that was super successful for us.
No doubt. I think, there is, because I've had that experience as well. I think especially, back when military leadership started getting on things like LinkedIn, it's people were actually quite accessible, and it's not a bad, arrow to have in the quiver. What I think is, an interesting companion to that part of the story, though, is that then you guys got in the room with those teams and you convinced the teams that you were legit. You kind of were able to build that trust, because I think this is what I see happen a lot is people think, okay, we've got this relationship at the senior most level, nobody else matters. And that's also not true, right? There are, you can have that lightning bolt from the 3-star, but if you can't then walk the walk, if you don't have D- work is fine, but you had work. It's not just slideware that stays as slideware until a big contract is signed, right? So what were the next steps from, okay, we got this amazing opportunity, we get invited in, we get to sit with this general's team. What are some of the next things that happened for you guys?
We made a very intentional point of getting as many of those folks, everyone from the majors all the way up to the colonels and lieutenant colonels, physically out to Mojave, where we were testing at the time, and getting in the airplane, going out flying. This is still, honest to God, sun reflector shield from AutoZone, dry ice taped to a Beagle Bone Blue we gave them a safety pilot, but physically was in the airplane flying autonomously, and building sort of that coalition around, all right, here's what it does. What would you like it to do? And then iterating on that quickly. And clearly we were building on our commercial roadmap, but getting customer feedback early and often was really important because it did 2 things. Made sure that we were building the thing that folks actually needed, and 2, build a ton of trust, right? That we were actually out there going and flying, and did so in a way where we got the, sort of the next level down below the sort of the general officers really, really, really involved in sort of the process. And, to be clear, it's not been without its challenges, right? Like, I think every one of these big programs dies like 5 or 6 deaths. And those 5 or 6 deaths always, always, always have come back to some misalignment between the strategic vision of the leadership and the middle of the org, and having that disconnect happen and not catching it, right? And then you have to do this sort of fire drill where you reconnect everyone and make sure that we're all sort of on the same sheet of music.
Totally. I think a lot of good points in there. When you guys, so you bring these folks out, you get them to actually get in your plane, which I imagine maybe some of them have no regard for safety and others are probably like, what in the world am I getting in that thing? Let's say you prove it out. What was like the first mechanism that you had in place for working with the government? Was it that CRADA, or did you guys have a different vehicle?
No, we've done CRADAs later in the history of the company, just to like cover down on like specific aircraft differences and other things that like don't warrant a full contract. But no, we very intentionally said no to like all CRADAs early. I think it's like cheap sugar of saying, hey, we have an agreement, but it's not actually like validation and product market fit. So we went direct to phase 2. So, Larson, Jensen, and Harpoon was just awesome in helping us, sort of work through that process and understand that process. And then we've been on to sort of much larger OTAs since. We will occasionally use a CRADA to like cover down on differences between airplanes, but we generally try to stay away from it.
Yeah, no, I think it's an increasingly common point of view for folks who have made it across some of these valleys, which is that if you spend too much time in experimenting, if you let everybody kind of feel good about not doing the real work of sales and customer discovery and everything early on, it's going to put you in a tenuous position. So when you think about what those early days, right? And many folks listening will know this, you can't just show up with a new aircraft or a new piece of software and just kind of stick it in a thing. There's all of this accreditation, there's testing and evaluation processes. How much did you know about those processes going in, and how much was it kind of like customer led versus you guys having to tell the customer like, hey, we have to go through these stage gates for you to be able to use this thing?
I think we knew a lot coming into it. I was pretty intentional, and sort of the early team was pretty intentional about hiring folks from some of those traditional companies that like had been there before and sort of knew some of the ecosystem. Unlike a lot of other defense tech startups, like anything in aviation, even in the military, is just so highly regulated. And there's like existing regulations that, there's just no pass go, like you've got to deal with. So I think us building up some of that maturity early on was actually pretty important to some of the customers doubling down on us, because they saw that we had that maturity, particularly around some certification standards. So on the software side, DO-178C, on the hardware side, DO-254, and building compliant systems to those standards. So that was super helpful. And then, you may have seen the announcement 2 or 3 months ago where we announced the first approved airworthiness plan of integrating autonomy onto a mainline Air Force aircraft. And that wouldn't have been possible without, sort of 4 years of work, dual certifying our core Merlin pilot, both with the civil regulator and the military regulator. I
saw you guys had another announcement, right, about this kind of like supplemental type certificate where you were doing something with the Cessna Grand Caravan that, hey, this has applicability for the 130J Hercules and for the Stratotanker. What kind of strategy did you all have about, are some kind of like easier almost to accredit that then would kind of leap to others? Or how did you think about kind of what certifications you went after?
We've taken sort of the harder strategy of like core certifying the core Merlin pilot, and then taking that core set of artifacts. So that's like 90% of the work. And then like the adaptation is the 10% of the work to a specific platform. Put like another way, if somebody taught you how to drive in a Toyota Camry and then said, hey, look, I need you to go drive an F-150, you'd clearly need to understand the differences between a Toyota Camry and F-150, but you wouldn't need to relearn how to be a driver. So we have core certified that core like flying capability. And then the differences between airplanes have to be certified by either the civil regulator or the military regulator. But we come into each one of those certification processes with 90% of the work done on that core pilot.
Makes sense. It's impressive because you're making an incredibly complex process sound extremely kind of like simple and orderly. And I'm curious, looking back on those early days, like, was there anything you got wrong? Like, what would you have done differently? I'm sure there's lots
Oh
of
my
stuff.
God. So many things. One of the things that we're thinking through right now is like a shift towards like smaller tactical aircraft in addition. So, our bread and butter has been in like very large, like 10,000 pound plus airplanes. Like, an F-16 is on the smaller end of at least the size spectrum of stuff that we're, sort of looking at and working on. I think what Ukraine showed us is that those big systems like the F-16 plus sized airplanes need to go work with those smaller systems. So just building earlier calories on some of those smaller aircraft would have been super important for us. But then again, like our wait list, our backlog of customers is way longer than the sort of the capability that we have. But it would have just been sort of a nice to have. And then I think sort of another thing we would have done, a little bit differently is making sure that we got like operational pilots into the product feedback loop earlier. So like the experimental test guys are awesome, like some of the like best people in the world. But like some of the issues that like a guy flying a KC-135 10 hours a day has, right, that like might not be exposed to an experimental test pilot, like those are very real and you have to go solve for that. So one of the things that we've done, I think pretty well over the past year or so has been getting sort of that 23, 24, 25-year-old operational pilot involved in like the pointy end of the spear of the development work. And that's paid huge dividends for us.
Those are two good ones, for sure. I think the customer feedback, not just, hey, we need customer feedback, it's who is delivering the feedback matters quite a bit. So that's pretty neat. Matt, as you guys now have got some of these big deals, and clearly you've been successful not only at building traction and building trust, but also in scaling that trust and getting others to care about what you're doing. I want to pivot to kind of looking forward, and what does success look like for you guys in the sense that, air autonomy, it's not the most, maybe it's not entirely competitive. It's not like there's 20 players, but it's not just you guys. There's some other folks in that space, and presumably, others own platforms or own sensors or own different pieces of the puzzle. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what's the Merlin thesis about why you guys are going to win and how you're going to grow in this market?
No, I mean, I think there's a huge challenge that I think only a few companies yet in this sort of relatively nascent defense tech space have had to face so far, which is the transition from relatively frothy promise to the hard work of delivering on that promise. And we are definitively in the deliver on the promise stage. And that's a bunch of stuff. It's building compliant facilities. It's building supply chain. It's building all those things that, I think like younger companies sort of poo-poo the big defense primes for being slow and having to go do all that. But as soon as you get to sort of the point that we're at and some others are at, you have to start to do those things. So we're thinking pretty closely around how do we team with more traditional players? How do we team with more traditional industrials and other folks in the space so we can do what we do really well, which is deliver great software, and work with folks who know how to do everything else really well, to deliver a great flexible capability for the customer. But it's hard work. It's not sort of the work that I think, especially a lot of the early stage companies think that they're getting into. But like as you get to scale, especially in the defense world, that's what you have to do, especially as you start to deliver on real revenue. Like we'll do hopefully a little shy of $80 million of revenue this year, which is like real money. But with that comes like real responsibility and also like a real shift in how we think about being a startup versus being a prime.
No, absolutely. It's you're starting to get into the place where you can't just move fast and break things, because the things that you break, introduce systemic risk, and you can't do that. So that's pretty neat. As you think about growth, then one of the things I wanted to ask is, you guys had an acquisition on the table earlier this year, right? You had looked at or announced kind of the acquisition of SBIR, and then kind of ended up that deal did not end up closing. And so I'm curious about if you could, we don't have to go into exquisite detail, but just tell us kind of what's the thesis around kind of some of that inorganic growth or that M&A activity, and kind of what happened that led you to say, hey, let's take a different path.
Yeah. So I think especially as, companies like us are looking at the future, there's some interesting capabilities that are out there in the market where it might make more sense for us or others like us to go buy those capabilities versus go build them, sort of in-house. I think Andrew's done a, remarkable job at doing that. and also like integrating those capabilities into their core offering. So, use cases like EpiSci, and, ultimately we chose to not complete that transaction, but like deals like that, or there's some others that we've considered and are considering where there is a really important set of value for our customers with like incredibly smart teams that are already working on that. It makes all the sense in the world to go combine forces and go deliver that capability. And honestly, I think you'll see more of that in the coming year or two, where there's folks that are working on point solutions. And if you look at sort of how the big defense primes grew, they grew by like accretive M&A. So I think it's a little bit outside of Anduril's core playbook, but like my prediction is that there will be some private equity backed roll-up vehicle that ends up rolling up a bunch of smaller point solutions in the market and like makes a run at some of the big defense tech startups.
So big defense tech startups or the big primes?
Both.
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be an interesting opportunity for somebody to use sort of a little bit of a PE playbook and roll up some of these capabilities and either go after folks like us or Shield or Anduril or some others, especially with a diversified portfolio approach to the problem. That's good, right? Like I think that's net good for the market. It provides a home for some of the smaller startups and provides the meaningful scale that we actually need to go change things in a way that none of the companies individually are able to do.
Right. And I think part of this, you and I have talked a little bit about it. Not every company is going to be a multi-billion-dollar IPO. There's got to be other off-ramps for founders who are building interesting and important capabilities here. I'm actually curious, why do you think M&A has been slow in the space so far? Because it feels like there's been this explosion of companies the last few years.
Well, I worry about it. Like I really, really, really worry about it. As we've sort of talked about before, if you look at the forward projections, like the 3-year forward projections of just sort of the cohort of companies that have raised over $10 million of venture capital, it would require the DoD to like 10x over 36 months the amount of money spent on non-traditional companies. The DoD is spending like 1% of its budget on non-traditionals. It would have to go like to 10-ish% to go absorb all the forward projections of the current venture-backed cohort of defense tech companies. And maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe I'm totally out to lunch here. But if you think the DoD is going to 10x their spending on non-traditionals, and by the way, the defense budget is not going to get remarkably larger. So that 10% is going to have to come out of traditional entrenched programs. So if you think that that's going to go from 1 to 10% over the next 36 months, I am skeptical of that. And if that's not the case, I think you're going to see a washout of a bunch of defense tech startups, and there's going to have to be some M&A outcome for those folks. And I think you're going to start to see much more, especially on the smaller scale, some opportunistic M&A. But I think on the larger scale, so companies like our size and bigger, I think you will probably see some really interesting like upside mergers with some of the more traditional players as they look at the sort of the larger market. But anyway, just my prediction.
No, I think it's this is math at some point. You can't have 17 primes doing the same thing. The market won't support it. You got one buyer. It's happened before. That was the consolidation. Previously, we needed kind of an explosion to get some new kind of capability and new fresh talent and fresh ideas. And I think we're not totally at the point yet where that can just collapse into 5 firms again. But we're going to have to. I think the one of the shifts that I'm hoping happens here is that we don't see M&A as a failure for a lot of founders. Now, if you take $500 million of venture capital and you merge and you don't deliver the outcome, that will inevitably be the case. But I think if we can get some alternative approaches to funding some of these companies, building capability for the mission is what matters here. Great financial outcomes are an enabler of that.
I think you'll see some big M&A. Like I think you'll see like big M&A in a way that is like economically really meaningful and returns capital and in sizable multiples. And I think that's what the industry needs to keep that cycle flowing.
That's a good thing. That's exciting. I hope so. I hope so. Matt, we'll let you go here in a minute. I think as you look forward and you think about not just Merlin, but the future of kind of autonomous flight in the next 18, 36, 2 to 3 years, what should we be looking out for? What do you expect? Are we going to be boarding American Airlines flights that are with no pilots in the cockpit?
No. What I'm really excited about is like sort of the first downs of autonomous flight. Like I think a lot of people have been sitting at the 50-yard line for a long time, hoping to like invent an anti-gravity football. And we're really excited about just sort of consistently moving the chains. And for us, we will get our system up flying in a production capacity on, sort of the C-130J and sort of the KC-135 this year. That's going to be exciting. It's going to be the first time like true takeoff touchdown autonomy is flying on a core, non-experimental Air Force sort of manned aircraft. And that's what we need to start building those hundreds of thousands of hours, millions of hours of experience and those sets and reps to go define what that sort of autonomous 100-year future looks like.
That's an exciting thing. I think it's a good one. Anything that you want to leave everybody with? First off, if folks are excited and inspired by what you're talking about here today, and they want to learn more about Merlin, they want to join the team, where should they go?
Yeah, just of course visit our website, but also like reach out. Like especially, I've eaten enough glass and gotten kicked in the teeth enough where like I find like a high degree of personal joy and like maybe trying to offer, at least from the cheap seats, some advice to, or at least a sounding board to other founders who are thinking about, defense tech or thinking about entering the market. I definitely don't have all the answers, and even the answers I think I have are probably not right. But like building sort of that ecosystem is important. Folks like Brian Schimpf have been incredibly generous with their time to, founders like us who are, maybe a couple years behind. And I think it's incumbent upon, founders that have gone through a couple rounds to offer that advice to the next generation. So if there are folks who are looking to think about, sort of the next thing, please reach out to me or others as a resource.
Make the call, pick up the phone, send the email. That's a great way
to don't bet a kidney to anyone, despite what don't bet a kidney.
Keep your kidneys. Keep your kidneys. Matt, this has been awesome. We're excited for what you're building at Merlin and excited to watch your progress in the years ahead. We're rooting for you. The country needs you. Thanks for what you're doing.
Awesome, Noah. Thank you so much.